Hi pre-K friends, it's so good to see all of you again today. I want to give you all a great big air hug since that's what you've been asking for on our Zooms. Today, I'm going to read Little Red Riding Hood. This is the classic story. I know Miss Martha read you Little Red Riding Hood where Riding Hood's on a bike, whereas this is the classic story, and then when we're finished, we'll compare and contrast the differences, the characters, the settings. We'll talk about things that are the same. And then we'll go through some other activities in my next video where we talk about syllables and reviewing the vocabulary words from the book. So let's get started. Little Red Riding Hood. It's retold by Gabby Goldsack and it's illustrated by Dubravka Kolonovec. I hope I said that properly. Before I start reading you the words, I want you to see the opening artwork. This is one of my favorite illustrations in this book. Let's get started. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived with her mommy in a cottage on the edge of a big forest. Whenever the little girl went outside to play, she wore a beautiful red cloak that her grandma had made for her. It had a big red hood, so everyone called the little girl, you got it, Little Red Riding Hood. One day, Little Red Riding Hood's mommy asked her to take a basket of food to her grandma. Grandma isn't feeling well, Mommy explained, and I'm sure she'd love to see you. Grandma lived on the other side of the forest, so Mommy drew a map on a piece of paper so that Little Red Riding Hood wouldn't get lost. I know how much you guys love your maps. And remember, don't talk to any strangers along the way, said Mommy, helping Little Red Riding Hood into her cloak. Little Red Riding Hood took the basket of food and skipped into the forest. Grandma might like these, she thought. As she bent down to pick a handful of flowers, she didn't realize someone else was in the forest. Hello, little girl, said a deep, growly voice. Little Red Riding Hood jumped with fright. A big wolf peered out from behind one of the trees. Oh, hello, said Little Red Riding Hood, smiling back at the wolf. She had already forgotten Mommy's warning. Where are you going? Growled the wolf. I'm visiting my sick grandma who lives on the other side of the forest, Little Red Riding Hood explained. Ah, what a kind girl you are, smiled the wolf, showing his razor-sharp teeth. Just then, the wolf's tummy gave a loud, rumbly grumble. What was that? Asked Little Red Riding Hood. Just some thunder over the hills, said the sneaky, hungry wolf, as he ran away as fast as he could to Grandma's house. So here's this picture of Little Red Riding Hood listening to the wolf. And then the hungry wolf peered through Grandma's window and saw the old lady in bed. With a loud howl, the wolf dashed into the cottage and gobbled up Grandma in one large gulp. Then the wolf put on Grandma's spare nightcap and glasses and clambered into her bed and pulled the quilt up to his chin. Now all he had to do was wait for Little Red Riding Hood to arrive. When Little Red Riding Hood reached the cottage, she was surprised to find the front door wide open. Grandma, she called, are you there? I'm in the bedroom, replied the wolf in a strange, wobbly voice. Little Red Riding Hood went into the bedroom and gasped in surprise when she saw her grandma. She looked sort of different. Grandma must be very sick, thought Little Red Riding Hood. I hope it isn't catching. What big eyes you have, Grandma, she said as she went over to the bed. Ah, the better for seeing you with, the wolf replied in the same wobbly voice. Grandma, what big ears you have, Little Red Riding Hood added, moving closer. All the better for hearing you with, said the wolf with a toothy grin. My, what big teeth you have, Grandma, stuttered Little Red Riding Hood. All the better for eating you with. My. Little Red Riding Hood screamed and tried to run away, but the hungry wolf was too fast. He leaped out of the bed and gobbled her up in a single greedy gulp. Oh, poor Red. A passing woodcutter heard Little Red Riding Hood scream, and he ran into the cottage. When he saw the wolf's enormous belly, he guessed what had happened. He picked up the wolf and shook him hard. Little Red Riding Hood and Grandma flew out of the wolf's mouth. Luckily, they weren't hurt, but they were very cross. That means they were very angry. Grandma, Little Red Riding Hood, and the woodcutter chased the wolf into the forest and over the hill. The embarrassed wolf never came back, and Little Red Riding Hood never spoke to strangers again. The end. All right, let's talk about the setting. Do you remember that the setting's where the story takes place? So this particular version of Little Red Riding Hood started in, you got it, the cottage. And the cottage was located in the forest. So the story took place in the cottage in the forest. And next, let's talk about our characters. The characters were the people or the animals in the story that did the action. So both stories had a grandma. Now she looked different in both stories, but the character was the same, a grandma. And of course, we had our main character, Little Red Riding Hood. And both stories had the wolf. Now this particular version had a different character. Think about, there was a man who had a job in the woods. Yeah, the woodcutter. The woodcutter was the character who was different in this version. Fairy tales also have a moral. A moral is the main message of the story. It's a positive message or a lesson to be learned. So what was the main lesson or the moral of this particular fairy tale? Yes, both of the mothers told Little Red Riding Hood, don't talk to strangers. They said, whatever you do, do not talk to strangers. And that's what the moral is. So now we're going to compare and contrast the differences in the story. When I compare, I see how things are the same, and when I contrast, I see how things are different. So let's compare the things that were similar, the things that were in each of the stories that were very close to being the same. In both stories, Little Red Riding Hood was wearing a red cape. And in both stories, Red Riding Hood went to visit her grandma. And in both stories, she loved her very much. And when she went to visit her, she took her a basket of food. Both stories had the character of the wolf. And in both stories, the wolf smiled at Little Red Riding Hood. And the most important thing was that in the very beginning, both of the mothers told Little Red Riding Hood, do not talk to strangers. And in both stories, they carried flowers to grandmother. Now let's look at the things that are different. Let's see what was contrasting in each story. The first thing that comes to mind to me is that in Miss Martha's story, Little Red Riding Hood was riding a bike, and in the original version, she was walking through the woods. The second thing is the setting. In Miss Martha's story, Little Red Riding Hood was riding her bike on the prairie, and in the original version, the story took place in the forest. And then also when we look at the characters of each story, we realize that in Miss Martha's version, there is no woodcutter. But in the classic version, there is, and he actually is the hero because he shakes Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood out of the wolf and they become free. In both stories, the girls carried flowers, but the contrast in the story was that in Miss Martha's version, Little Red Riding Hood found white flowers. And in the version I read, she carried blue flowers. Also, instead of carrying a basket of goodies, in Miss Martha's story, Little Red carried a basket of muffins. And the wolf wanted that recipe from Little Red Riding Hood in that version. The other things that were different were in Miss Martha's story, the grandma was not in bed. She tricked the wolf. Did you notice that? In Miss Martha's story, the grandma was the farmer and the wolf could not find her in the bed. She was on the tractor. Whereas in my story, Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother got gobbled by the wolf, and then the wolf was in bed pretending to be the grandmother. Did anybody notice something really different? Think really hard. Think about the wolf. In one version, Miss Martha's, he was wearing clothes. And in my version, he was just a regular old wolf you'd find out in the forest. At the end of Miss Martha's story, the wolf worked for Big Red. And Big Red was Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother. So it's almost like this story was a sequel to the original version because Little Red grew up, became Big Red, which is grandma, and then Little Red Riding Hood was the granddaughter, now riding her bike to see grandma, and they all worked in the bakery together. I hope you enjoyed both stories, and when we have our Zoom meeting, we'll ask you which one was your favorite. So next week, we will talk about the vocabulary words that were in the book, and then also we'll work on syllables. Bye for now. Love you guys.